Hello and welcome back to Exothermic Plays Games. I'm Exothermic and the date today is Tuesday, May 28th, 2024. I've been doing a countdown of my favorite video games of all time through each day of the year, and coming in at number 218 to celebrate my birthday is Final Fantasy 1. As I've mentioned in a couple of my videos, I've played a lot of Final Fantasy. There's 21 Final Fantasy games on this list, 24 if you count Kingdom Hearts. I love Final Fantasy. To talk about this game being today, I need to explain the process by which the majority of these rankings happened. First, I came up with a list of about 400 games as the short list. Ironic, I know. Then I whittled it down to about 375 and copy-pasted that list into a head-to-head ranker website. That then showed me two things from the list, and I just had to press left or right to indicate which one I liked more. I did that a few thousand times, and it came up with an order. I did some light editing, mostly looking within franchises with several entries to make sure that franchise would be in the order that was correct within itself. That's when I discovered that, perhaps by fate, the first game in what is perhaps the most influential gaming franchise of my life was ranked on my 30th birthday. It was destiny for me to talk about Final Fantasy today. With how important and influential this title is, even though I recorded with the Pixel Remaster version, which can have upgraded graphics and a full orchestral score, I find it far more enjoyable to play this game on the classic settings for the full nostalgia trip. Now, on to the game. Final Fantasy released in Japan on December 18th, 1987 for the Famicom or NES, and was developed by Square. Supposedly, Square was on the brink of bankruptcy, but they could still crank out one more game. They called this their Final Fantasy. Whether or not the company fully rode on the success of this title has been disputed a bit, but there's no doubt it was on their minds when coming up with the name. Clearly, the game was an instant success, and the company is now one of the largest developers in the world. It was such a success for them that many of the core elements from this game are still present in modern titles in the franchise. You start off by making your party of 4. Unlike in most Final Fantasy games, there's not really any story to the party, and you can customize them to your liking. Each character can be one of 6 jobs. There's Fighter, which is a well-rounded combatant that can equip almost anything. Then Thief, which lacks the damage output of the other melee classes, but has a very high evasion stat. And then Monk, which is all about pure damage output. White Mage, which is a caster that does healing and other support abilities, but also dishes out holy damage against undead. Black Mage, which is essentially a weapon of mass destruction. And lastly, Red Mage, which is a true jack-of-all-trades. It can cast some, but not all of the spells that both White and Black Mage can cast, while also being a fairly formidable melee combatant as well, just not as durable as Fighter, or quite as hard-hitting as Monk. Historically, I'd opt to do 3 red mages and 1 white mage, but I wanted to diversify my party to show off more of the jobs in this video. I'm going to get pretty spoilery here, so if you want to avoid story spoilers for a nearly 37-year-old game, pause the video and click on the timestamp in the description to get to my final thoughts. You play as 4 heroes of prophecy and must venture forth to restore the elemental crystals of earth, air, fire, and water to prevent the world from falling into total darkness and despair. The story to the first Final Fantasy is pretty straightforward, other than the fact that the first boss you fight and kill is actually also the last boss in the entire game. But don't worry, there's lots of bosses in between. Go beat up an old man to save a princess, then beat up a bunch of pirates to get a boat, so you can find a crazy lady's eye, so you can wake up a guy and take his key, so you can get enough dynamite to make the Panama Canal, and then you can start saving these crystals. People talk about how grindy the early Final Fantasy games are, and don't get me wrong, they are, but I think memory of Final Fantasy 1 is fairly skewed. I spent more time getting to the point where I could actually progress in the main part of the story than it took to actually perform the main part of the story. That includes an insane amount of level grinding, and then once you get into the proper dungeons and fighting big bosses, things go a lot quicker. Pro tip for the level grinding: the tier 2 damaging spells like Fira, or in the original release it would just be called Fire 2, are a huge time saver to wipe enemies. When making your party, make absolutely sure you have at least one black mage or red mage available. Same goes for having specifically a white mage to deal with undead enemies, since red mage can't use Dia. The first crystal you save is the Earth Crystal, which has been besieged by an ancient lich. While the crystal is losing its power, the earth itself in the region is rotting, which is a pretty difficult thing for sustaining life, it turns out. Thanks to some solid preparations and elemental magic strengths, the Lich isn't that hard of a boss for this party, but if you had a party with only one spellcaster, you might have more difficulty. From there, you quickly go to the next crystal. Head on over to a remote lake village and you'll discover the 12 sages, led by the person who literally made the prophecy about you. Pretty weird for an ancient prophecy. Feel like you could have been a bit more proactive with solving this doom and gloom we're all in. Anyways, he gives you a canoe. Take the canoe into the volcano, where you'll find that unlike in Final Fantasy III, which I ranked as my 253rd favorite game, the lava hurts you. Make your way into the Fire Crystal's chamber and you'll fight Merilith. This is definitely a big step up of a boss fight from the Lich and requires some preparation. I clearly didn't make enough preparation and almost died here, but managed to pull it out. Spellcasting in the first Final Fantasy is done via spell slots. There's different tier spells that you assign to 3 slots within that tier for each spellcasting character, and then based on your character's level, you have access to a number of uses from that tier before you rest again at an inn. This makes long dungeons especially dangerous, as you have to conserve your spell slots as much as you can for when you'll really need them. That's one of the main reasons I strongly prefer the triple red mage single white mage party, because it still has good damage output from the red mage's melee attacks, but can take advantage of all sorts of spells across the whole party. With this boss, I was running on fumes for my spell slots and I struggled from an early big attack. I was prepared thanks to my Null Blaze that my red mage cast for any follow-ups, plus the Protera from my white mage for melee attacks, but I did struggle to get back on my feet right away. But hey, this is the kind of excitement we play games for! From there, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump into an icy cave where you go through a labyrinth of falling through the floor to secure the Levistone, which allows you to access an airship, giving you full maneuverability around the map at last. Now, you're able to go upgrade your jobs. Unlike in other Final Fantasy games with the job system, you can't switch them around at will in this first game, and are stuck with the choices you made at the start of the game. However, at this point you can upgrade them into stronger versions of themselves. Head to the Citadel of the Trials and go through a maze of teleporters. Once you figure it out, you'll have to beat some zombie dragons and get out of there with the mythical rat tail? Sure, whatever. Take the rat tail to a cluster of islands with holes in the ground, and as you explore them, you'll find some intelligent bipedal dragons who actually have no interest in fighting you. Get to Bahamut and impress him with your mighty rat tail. He bestows you with power, upgrading each of your character's jobs. Fighter becomes knight, gaining the ability to cast some white magic. Thief becomes ninja, finally becoming relevant in actual combat, and gives the ability to cast some black magic. Monk becomes master, which largely remains the same, but gains defense stats while leveling up at a higher rate than Monk did. And lastly, white, black, and red mages all become their appropriate colors wizards, giving each of them access to more powerful magic than they otherwise could do. I had planned to keep recording this game until I beat it all in one sitting, and planned to pretty much pull an all-nighter to do so, but apparently, now that I'm turning 30 years old, that's impossible, and I promptly fell asleep despite my best efforts to stay awake around 2 in the morning. But basically, from getting your upgraded jobs, you go to the water dungeon, kick a Kraken's ass, which would have been fairly easy with my party thanks to having multiple magic users with Thundaga. Then I'd go to the Wind Crystal and kick Tiamat's ass, since my Black Wizard would have access to plenty of flare casts at that point, and I should have enough healing between the White and Red Wizards to keep everyone else alive. Lastly, we go defeat the creator of the 4 fiends that were assaulting the crystals, Chaos himself, who is actually a time loop incarnation of Garland, the old man whose ass we kicked at the start of the entire game. Ta-da! The world is saved. Final Fantasy is a classic game, and for good reason. The story is simple, but the journey is memorable. All of the visual design is clear and unique, with the Black Mages in particular being one of the best character designs in history. I'm saying that not just for video games, for the record. There is something so iconic about a classic Black Mage. Almost every idea presented in the game sticks around for at least the next 20 years, from the jobs, to the monsters, the combat, and many tropes that pop up, if nothing else in reference to the original. However, perhaps none are so important to the distinct style and success of Final Fantasy than the music, all created by Nobuo Uematsu. When he was hired to make the music for the game, he had done some commercial work, namely in, well, commercials, but did not consider himself a full-time composer. He was essentially requested to come up with just a handful of songs, namely a battle theme, a town theme, probably a couple of other things. There are 20 songs on the soundtrack, and they're every single one of them absolute bangers. Many of them are worked into music for the franchise even in the newest entries, which aren't composed by Uematsu, who's semi-retired at this point. It is astounding to me how the music, like everything else with the game, was able to be so refined and beautifully executed within the limitations of the NES. Join me tomorrow as I talk about the 217th game on my list, where I am tossed a disappointingly low number of coins.